Okay, cool. I'll also disclaimer, it's a debate. Personal opinions are orthogonal, so on and so forth. Starting in 3, 2, 1. The United States is not a police state. It's a terrorist safe haven for men in blue who masquerade as extrajudicial assassinators who accuse those of being guilty of the sole crime of being a black man in the 21st century. What will we do at opening government? First, characterize what this policy entails. Secondly, explain why we get community buy-in, and then run a bunch of arguments on community safety, on crime prevention, and movement politics. First, on framing. What does this look like under our side of the house? The Black Lives Matter movement has strong organic political incentives to provide training resources to ensure that individuals engaged in these crime prevention gangs and movements are trained in de-escalation protocols, and over time an institutional apparatus evolves to ensure that patrols are working effectively. In terms of what these patrols do on a day-to-day basis, they're likely moving around communities with weaponry openly available, engaging not directly in violent attacks against the police, but rather acting as a deterrent force, conducting criminal investigations, collecting witness evidence and eyewitness testimony, and responding to crime which is otherwise ignored by white police officers. Secondly, why is it likely that these patrols get substantial buy-in from the local community? In many instances, the local police force does not match the demographics of the community. So in a place, for example, like the south side of Chicago, many white police officers operate in areas which are predominantly inhabited by black civilians. Under our side, the force tasked with responding to crime looks more like you and you trust them more. Furthermore, the BLM movement has strong incentives to message and justify the existence of these patrols, to rationalize the existence of these patrols operating in your community. And these organizations have strong internal incentives to prove their worth and prove their efficacy, unlike the police force, which is given a de facto monopoly on the usage of violence. And in many instances, people are sufficiently fed up with an ineffective status quo, they'll place their faith in the next best alternative. Before I move into constructive arguments, any clarification? Gorgeous. First argument. How do we better safeguard black communities on our side of the house? A range of mechanisms. Firstly, we substantially improve feelings of safety within communities. Why is that? Setting aside the very obvious fact that these communities greatly increase deterrence, inasmuch as police officers are often unwilling to care about these communities and hence under-police areas chronically, often leading criminals to believe they can get away without being caught, and by the fact that we create a signaling effect on our side of the house that crime will not be tolerated because BLM armed organizations rove around the community to ensure that crime is caught. We also improve safety in a range of other ways. In many instances, people do not feel safe in their own communities, and their houses do not feel like homes. They do not attend school or go to playgrounds or hang out in parks because they feel like safety is not available. Why is that? Because opposition's in a double bind. Either you have police officers in the area, for example, in high crime areas where crime tends to happen like public parks, in which case people often feel unsafe because they do not trust the police as a consequence of legacies of discrimination. Or there is no law enforcement present, in which case people still credibly fear crime. The best alternative under our side of the house is Black Lives Matter's organizers setting up armed patrols in those areas to make people feel like they can send their kids to the playground and see them hang out with other kids, that people can go to school without fear of crossing gang lines, all of which means that the community cohesion necessary for political mobilization is greater under our side. Second mechanism, this existence creates a plausible alternative to gang infrastructure. Many people join gangs at a young age, often in their adolescence. Why? Because they fucking need protection. Because in many instances, if you live in a place like St. Louis, to go to school requires you to cross dangerous territories where you do not feel safe, and the police are unwilling to provide you with support, and you're certainly not wealthy enough to hire private security forces, which often means people are forced to join gangs out of necessity. The existence of these organizations is a powerful and better alternative that your parents are more likely to support you joining. But also, people in many instances join criminal organizations because they lack community, because they grew up in a community where their father was in prison, where they were not able to graduate high school. Under our side, for many disadvantaged youth, particularly men, joining these organizations provides them with that community in a way that Black Lives Matter protests or rallies simply don't, because the intensity of experience is so much greater on our side of the house, hence reducing gang infrastructure and recruitment. Thirdly, under our side, we solve the chronic problem of under-policing. Over-policing may very well be a problem that stays on either side of the house. I'll explain why it gets better in a moment, but assume for a moment police conduct stays the same. Under-policing is a huge problem in areas like Chicago, where literally dozens of murders every year are never solved. The structural reason being that police forces are often under-resourced and cash-strapped, time power, or frankly willingness to investigate homicides and so forth. Under our side, people are more likely to report crime to these community patrols because they have faith in them, as I've explained, which means people are more likely to be deterred from committing crime when there is now someone responding to instances of armed larceny or assault physically, but also we are more likely under our side of the house to investigate and subsequently solve crimes the police literally don't investigate otherwise. So not only do we improve reporting of crime, a logical prerequisite to ever solving crime and providing catharsis to victims, we also reduce crime in the very first instance. All of which means that under our side of the house, we make people feel safer. Before I also explain a bunch of other arguments on movement politics and policing, CO.
Yeah, the NYPD costs $10 billion a year. Where are you funding this giant militia that's going to magically be more effective?
Sure, we're not saying it's more effective, but one, the BLM movement has a wide range of support. 21 million people protested on the streets in June of 2020. It's likely that many individuals, particularly wealthy white moderates, are willing to back the movement. Furthermore, this is likely a low-cost operation, in as much as you simply need to develop an institutional apparatus, but the funding costs aren't likely to be high. You're sending people out on patrol, and many people are willing to do this, often in their spare hours. And furthermore, crime is often concentrated in specific sections of the day, like between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m., which often means people are doing this outside of work. Funding isn't a concern. Let's talk movement politics. Policing probably becomes a lot better on our side of the house. There is now a competitive pressure available because if the police force doesn't improve its game, people will likely instead turn towards these alternative organizations to report crimes and work with them, forcing police forces to institute internal mechanisms which reduce racial bias. Opposition will say, aha, but there's backlash. That probably fades in the long term as these become a norm, and it's probably marginal given that Tucker Carlson is the jackass either way. But also, this is a uniquely easy policy to justify, often on a right-wing basis of this is pro-guns. And to the extent there is backlash, backlash is often good if it leads to an increased political capital for gun control and regulation of guns, which often stops the inflow of guns into these communities, limiting violence in totality. But there's other reasons to believe this is good for the movement. It energizes the radical wing of the Black Lives Matter community. Many people on their side of the house do not feel like the movement is sufficiently taking matters into their own hands. Not only does that mean that you get non-BLM vigilante organizations arising independent of this motion, it also means people still engage in radical messaging, which fuels the backlash opposition fears. We also shift the Overton window more on our side of the house. The best way for the BLM movement to get change is not to post black squares on Instagram. It's to have real bargaining power that comes from armed black men being in these communities and having plausible influence in local government negotiations. All of which means under our side of the house, you are more likely to get grassroots justice, people feeling safe and reducing the incidences of crime. Could not possibly be prouder to support a fantastic idea.
All right, I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for that very fine speech. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome the leader of opposition here.
POIs preferably verbally and at 5. And I'll take you then. Time will start at my first word. In the status quo, black men get shot for doing literally nothing. They'll just be sitting in their car, reach for the glove compartment, and the state will shoot them. And for some reason, opening government thinks that when you get many black men patrolling the street, holding guns, and explicitly saying they want to act as a deterrent just in case they perceive that police might do something, that feeds into the excuse that the police always give, that they think that there was a threat and they reacted in self-defense. And because of the military-industrial complex and the strength of police unions in the United States, there are things that make it such that these police officers literally almost get zero repercussions when they do this because they have institutional things in place that make it such that at worst they get suspended with pay for a bit and then get their job back, so there is nothing defending them. But note, this isn't just about state-sanctioned violence. Opening government also has to reckon with the fact that people like Andrew Zimmerman could shoot Trayvon Martin in cold blood because they thought that he might have been potentially dangerous, even though he literally did nothing. I think when you advocate for people holding a gun, even for the people who do not opt into this, even if this is a good idea, the fact that there are people who didn't consent into the added violence that will happen to them when the perception against them gets much worse is probably something they need to deal with. And I want to preempt the lazy response that DPM or CG might give, which is just like, there is already a maximal pressure to perceive black folks as violent. Obviously, we have seen that there is a trend vis-a-vis the fact that the amount of people who would vote for someone like Trump in 2012 dramatically increased between 2012 and 2016. Clearly, there are people who are being convinced by this. Clearly, there are people who are moderates, so not everyone is just maximally radical, but also to the extent that people buy into these policies, I think that at like a structural level, they'll probably vote differently, even if they aren't necessarily the people who hold the guns. I'm going to do direct rebuttal to the arguments later, but I want to advance a couple of arguments. First, points of framing. Who makes up the Black Lives Matter movement? Because they're not the Black Panthers. The Black Lives Matter movement is actually relatively moderate. It's people like DeRay McKesson wearing his fun vest on Ellen. It's people working within the system and relying on like establishment politicians, specifically Democrats who are staunchly anti-open carry and staunchly anti-citizen neighborhood policing groups. People like AOC, people like Ilhan Omar, people like Bernie Sanders are all people who have made anti-gun laws a strong part of their campaign and are also people who have vocally backed BLM and have vocally backed their specific policies, the kinds of policies they want to pass. Corporations like Nike also back you. Media platforms choose to platform you, specifically leftist media platforms that don't want to platform people that are anti-gun. What are the goals of the BLM movement? Something that was not brought up by the last speech. One, it is passing things like policies like police brutality, but it is also noting the fact that people like Andrew Zimmerman, because of gun open carry laws, can shoot black people in the street without recourse. But notably, it's not just that. BLM is a massive mutual aid network, providing things like legal aid, providing things like rent subsidies, providing things like food, providing things like shelters. All of these things don't just need money, they need government buy-in, because notably, the ability to build a shelter when BLM wants to support and back it is something that a politician needs to be able to use on their campaign platform and say, hey, I worked with BLM to build one more shelter to help homeless black folks in a segregated and gentrified area. Notably, that gets harder when the movement that they want to help is one that is seen as particularly radical. Finally, they want to change narratives. They want to overturn the perception of black people as dangerous and violent, something that has been institutionalized in America for the past 300 years. Two arguments then. First, on changing policies. Note that this outweighs the extent to which the individual people on the ground feel safer when there are armed patrols, because these policies happen either at a state, and at that level we're outweighing on scope, but even on a national level especially are outweighing on scope. So, 4 things here. First, government support gets considerably harder when AOC can't back you, when the media won't platform your ideas so people aren't willing to vote for you or view you as palatable. 2, internally people are less likely to support you, given that many people in BLM have seen the things that happened with Trayvon Martin and know that, like, even if you act with intention to want to use these guns to help other people, just the perception of an organization of a few people holding guns, walking around trying to be safe is proximate enough to what the police look like that just because they say they want to do it for a good reason is not something that necessarily people are going to buy into. And note that just because they support this policy, they can't fiat the perfect implementation. I think the COPOI is correct here to suggest that there's a funding problem. But beyond that, there's also just a logistics problem. Like, BLM is able to organize protests because protests are logistically simple enough where you get a lot of people to walk in the area and hold signs. Organizing an armed patrol has many more logistical hurdles and things like this. 3, I think there's in the movement, which are important when you want to do things like coalition build and with other movements or work internally to get people to coalesce on specific narratives or ideas that are important for people to buy onto them. So it is just comparatively harder to push those important policies they want to pass, policies that have much more structural advantages than the kinds of things like you get from the deterrents. Second argument then, I think they are going to be absolutely terrible for the safety of black bodies. Couple of reasons here. First, the mutual aid argument is incredibly strong here. You know what kills more people than policemen or guns? Poverty. The ability to get incarcerated when you do not have legal aid. Getting kicked out of your home so you don't have the ability to get a job because you do not have an address. These are all things that BLM helps with in spades because they have organized and connected other mutual aid networks to one another. They have used their platform and said, donate to this specific person. So a lot of people just get a lot less support. These are people who've been structurally disenfranchised and kept away from the government. 2, there will be more violence as per the backlash argument we made earlier when you perceive black folks as being more dangerous. Before I move on, closing.
Do you believe that the average black individual in America actually feels represented by the Black Lives Matter movement?
So, if your claim is that they'll feel more represented when they go out and bring guns, the argument we would bring is that a lot of black people are actually relatively conservative. Look to how black folks in the Baptist church and every Southern black coalition have explicitly said that they are not fans of things like defund the police, are not fans of things like, oh, we need to have more violent, progressive, liberal, militant action. They are more in favor of things like reallocating some of that money to things like social aid and mutual welfare that we're talking about, They are people who have bought into the idea that like Martin Luther King Jr. was the greatest person to do any form of activism. I think a lot of my case implicitly responds to what they said, but there's a couple of things here. First, they say the weaponry will solely act as a deterrent to the police. That may be how you frame it, but that's not how the police will interpret it. And when they shoot people, that will make people way more scared to participate in things like protests because they're worried there will be violent preemptive action from the police against those protests. So it makes it harder for you to do like peaceful actions as well, preempting arguments that we can do both. Second, they say the black community feels safe. Couple of things with this. One, I think a lot of people in the black community just feel like all guns are often dangerous because of the violence that's been done to them by guns. Two, fear of firefights between the police and BLM, or gangs and the BLM, are also things that they're probably worried about, so that's probably bad. But three, I think there's a question of implementation here. Like, is BLM organized enough to implement something that requires this much infrastructure? Unclear. Finally, they try to preempt backlash. I think Muzamil will give a broader response to this later, but I do not think that they are more likely for people to think, oh, BLM is so dangerous, we now need to remove open carry laws. If anything, they'll say we need even more guns to shoot BLM. For all of these reasons, proud to oppose.
All right, I'd like to thank the leader of opposition for the very fine speech. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
Hello. I'm sorry. I prefer POIs in the chat. I will probably take one from CO and probably at around 4 or 5. Cool. By the way, am I like audible and visible?
Yes, you are.
Great. Okay. I'm gonna begin in yeah, okay. I'm gonna begin in 3, 2, 1. I'm gonna talk about two things in this speech. First, I'm gonna justify whether or not this policy is actually effective. So Ryan gave a couple of mechanisms, right? The response that we get from CO and a POI, and also largely from OO, is that BLM does not have the resources in order to implement this correctly. I have two responses to this. One, I don't want to understate how large BLM is as a movement. It is an extraordinarily large movement, especially in recent times where it's very easy to grow social movements, right? Social media exists. Ideologies compound with each other, and that if you talk to other people about BLM, what they're doing, they talk to others, etc. But two, Ryan points out that this is probably deployed in very specific areas, aka places with high concentrations of black people or high concentrations of crime. You probably aren't going to do this in places with low or no crime. You probably aren't going to do this in places where there are not as many African Americans or not as many people of the BLM movement, right? Which means that we can selectively concentrate our resources. So in the worst, and third, just in the worst case, okay, maybe we don't have enough resources to completely take over the police force. Maybe we don't have billions of dollars, but we are marginally better on our side for all the reasons that Ryan talks about, right? On how you probably aren't going to do things like, you're probably going to feel a lot you're probably going to feel a lot safer. You're probably going to trust these patrols. This is an alternative to gang infrastructure. All of those things are marginally better on our side. This also kind of collapses the debate, right? And that all of your things are probably mitigated if you claim that like the BLM movement is never able to do this. The main push that we get from OO is that they say that you justify overfunding the police and justify police violence. But this argument is hung on a simple claim, right? That the BLM movement is going to go about doing these patrols in highly extremist ways. Because look, the right wing can always frame the movement as radical. It's moderates that we need to sway. But moderates aren't likely to view these patrols as crazy, right? Left-wing media probably is sympathetic to this cause. We claimed that this would be done in smart and strategic ways in which moderate media is probably going to struggle to antagonize, right? And Ryan gives a couple of reasons, but I'm just going to reiterate this, right? This is probably going to be done well because BLM communities have every single incentive to do for this to happen well, right? And that they care about optics both within and outside of the movement. They don't want violence on black people to increase, right? Which means that they're going to focus a lot on things like de-escalation tactics. This also kind of takes out a lot of what Elo says, like a couple of one-liners in like 7 minutes or 6 minutes 30 about how, like this is going to be bad because black people don't really like firearms because of the past or whatever reason, because they have had bad encounters with the police. All of those things get mitigated when Ryan explains to you that the BLM movement is probably going to implement this well and implement this strategically. Furthermore, it's likely that BLM patrols work collaboratively with the police force over time. For instance, things like sharing evidence and working on cases, right? Police officers are likely to do this because doing so boosts their rate of solving crime, and the BLM movement is likely to do this to safeguard black communities, and because they just get more resources, and also because going completely against the police is probably bad policy. Over time, this means that we get more collaboration. This allows us to moderate the police force by getting a foot in the door, and also allows people to gradually feel safer reporting crime to the police force. We also backlash in the very long term. And at first, this idea kind of seems crazy. By the way, I'm going to go more about backlash later on. But over time, this becomes a norm. Just like community crime reporting forums seemed insane in the 60s, but are normalized now. What else did they say? They say, actually, I'll take a POI right now.
You're simultaneously telling us that they're going to be anti-police and then they're going to collaborate and give evidence for illegitimate laws. How will local people feel when these illegitimate laws are activated by their own militia?
Okay, I don't really know what you mean by illegitimate laws. What I'm saying is that obviously these things are going to be distinct from the police force, and for people that do not have as much of a trust in the police force, they can go to these BLM movements, but there is still going to be some semblance of cooperation between the BLM movements and the police force, just because these movements armed community patrols do need these resources. Secondly, is this movement affected, right? Is the movement as a whole affected? The first thing that OO says is that you are fragmenting this movement because leftist media platforms no longer want to cover this. I have two responses. One, at the end of the day, leftist politics also want to win. The BLM movement and minority movements in general are a huge voter group because of everything we've said before about the BLM movement is just huge right now, because social movements can grow very easily in the status quo, which means that you're incentivized to do this anyway, right? And that you even if the BLM movement kind of fucks up, you still want to fund them, you still want to be on the good, you still want to be on their good side in order for you to ensure their vote on a Democratic Party. And every marginal and the Democratic and Republican parties are neck and neck. Secondly, there are people that are centrist or that are pro-gun that are going to support this on our side. And that is actually kind of hard for specific groups of right-wingers to criticize this as well, right? In that right-wingers that believe in pro-gun, hard on crime, people that like deterrence a lot. This fragments a potential conservative offense. And this is very important because you don't get critical mass and a pushback by the right movement on our side, right? And that you seem weaker as a movement because you are morally inconsistent with yourself. The difference is that we win over some people, but we lose some. I am unsure as to why, I'm unsure at the end of Ella's speech as to why you get more people that dislike what BLM is doing than more people liking what BLM is doing. More responses to backlash. I think it's the opposite, right? In that radical voices are more vocal and hardline on their side because they feel the movement isn't living up to the moment. So it's easier for conservatives to dismiss BLM as crazy and radical. We bring them into the fold. Furthermore, the BLM community is likely to run these patrols smartly, doing so in ways that make it hard for conservatives to demonize these movements. Additionally, you can easily sell these organizations to those on the right, blah, 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 right? A huge problem for the BLM movement is that it is perceived as soft on crime. We reverse this perception. Additionally, I think it's good for the movement to take a radical stance, even in our worst case if we are seen as radical. This is for a couple reasons. One, we limit the co-optation of the BLM movement by virtue signaling white progressives on social media who on their side crowd out real black voices. And two, the movement has more bargaining power on your side. You have the option to say, we will tone down the rate of patrols if you give us concessions. This is the best way to get bargaining power given how disenfranchised black Americans are. Okay, more stuff. What else did they say? They say backlash is going to occur from the general majority of people, and they also say that the average person is going to be very scared of black people because you have this preconceived notion that black people are violent and you are minorly racist, and this amplifies it. Two things. One, I think this is kind of low impact, right? In that the BLM movement is not usually at the forefront of the average non-black person's mind. This is especially for conservatives that aren't in high crime areas. They aren't going to care too much about this because there aren't black people in their areas patrolling, right? The much greater impact is what happens on the ground. Everything Ryan talks about how this is going to be implemented well, and thus people are going to feel safer, thus deterrence is probably going to exist, thus this puts a competitive pressure on the police force. I think the much greater debate is happening there. But secondly, backlash is usually quite short-term. It is hard to continuously wage war against movement politics. Now, there are many other policies that you need to talk about. Things like things like everything else that BLM does. You have limited political capital as a conservative movement, and you need to pick and choose your battles. The last thing I want to say is that this is very contingent on everything else in this debate. If we prove that, which we have, that this is implemented correctly, I don't think that backlash is going to exist as much on our side.
Alright, I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for the very fine speech. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition here.
Hello.
Is it working now?
Yeah, it is.
Okay, yeah, okay, I fixed the audio problem. Okay. Cool. Yeah. 3, 2, 1. I'm going to win the top half in 2 ways. First, on politics, and second, on safety. Before that, the important concession from opening government. Look, it is probably true that BLM's primary goal isn't just community safety. They focus on lots of other things, mutual aid and other types of things. And if I can prove that these are more affected, I would posit these harm significantly more people on their side of the house. The first way opening opposition wins, very clearly, is on funding. And I want to note, this is exogenous to all of opening government where they say, maybe you get some degree of reform, maybe you don't. Just the trade-off in the investment to guns and infrastructure that the opening government wants for this to be implemented well is relatively large. There are 2 things that I want to note here. First, you often have significant amounts of money going into these guns. It's expensive to buy firearms. They aren't as cheap as opening government claims, and training is often expensive. You need experts and other types of people to be able to engage in this within the first place. What this means is that this is often the large trade-off with other types of resources that you could do. So it's billions of dollars spent on buying guns versus the comparative. What was the comparative? It is giving people things like rent guys. It is finding them jobs. It is actively providing them the ability to go up the social ladder and actively improving perceptions that way. Why is this better? 1, these are more tangible goods that are given to the average person and are often more impactful in their daily lives. So maybe a couple of people face the degree of crime that the opening government wants, but in the vast majority of instances, hunger is an instant killer and means that lots of people are harmed much more on their side of the house. Homelessness, for example, is a much larger problem because it literally means you're on the streets. You cannot access jobs etc on their side of the house due to the massive funding trade-off. This is literal things on the ground that people actively suffer significantly more than opening government. Secondly, how do we win on moderates and why do we win on the role model stuff that opening government claims? So OG's problem is that their case is hung on a characterization that BLM remains large on their side of the house. I'll prove why it doesn't in 3 ways. Because their only claim is, guys, trust us, people are going to continue supporting you. Firstly, I would posit that this evokes memories of the Black Panthers. They were often seen as really radical, and many white people still have memories against this and see this as the time of violence. You're unlikely to view this very positively. Second, the left has an inherent hatred of guns. I would posit that yes, you want political victories, but when you alienate the Latino community, when you alienate the Muslim community, when you alienate every other leftist voter who has been talking about gun control laws to a fairly large extent, left is willing to make this trade-off on their side of the house. Third, guns are just really scary. It's very difficult to actively carry guns and say, guys, this is a great thing. I just think moderates are unlikely to believe this, especially at the point where the police paints this as. They are going against the rule of the law. They want to challenge the law, and the right wing is likely to do this. Opening government's response is you are likely to implement this in good ways. Note the problem with this. Even if implementation is done well, it is often characterized to be done badly. Because 1, moderates often believe that carrying these guns is inherently wrong, so I don't care if you have the gun done well, the fact that they can see the gun is already enough. But second, media outlets have the incentive to sensationalize this. They often make it really controversial. It's a great way for them to get significant amounts of buy-in onto their platforms, etc. on the comparative. That means on politics, we significantly have moderates turning away. There are 3 implications on moderates and celebrities that I want to talk about. First, this means you often don't get things like petitions signed. You don't get things like actively passing policy within our world. This means on our side of the house, we're going to have significant changes on the comparative. Secondly, we would know that more people voting for BLM policies is generically good. That means that on the comparative, when you have more people voting for defund the police, when you have more people voting for police reform, because they actively don't see this as a threat to the police, I think you're likely to get significantly more change. The second way you impact this is on celebrities and others, because many large institutional donors don't want to be part of massive political shifts. And this is really important on opening government, because the only claim we get from OG is, guys, trust us, these people are going to continue funding you. No, they are not. They're likely to fund other NGOs and other types of things because you see it as controversial, because many right-wing people actively oppose you, and much of the left does. What this means is you don't get Beyonce actively giving you those $5 million that were really necessary. It's wealthy black moderates who no longer fund you on the comparative, because it's likely the case that they don't care about the movement to the same extent. Why does this funding matter? It's the vast majority of money that you actively need to do opening government's policy. So if you want to buy guns, if you want to do anything that they wanted to talk about, impacts on the ground are only accrued at the point where you have this money within the first place. Secondly, moderates obviously matter at the point where this is a large number of donations of the comparative. I think this means you're going to cause significant harm on opening government on their side of the house. The second way is that this changes the messaging on their side of the house, and this often causes significant harm. Note that on our side of the house, these are often uncontroversial messages, like don't shoot black people, versus the comparative narrative that exists on their side of the house. It is that black people should carry guns and should actively shoot people if you try doing this. This often reinvents the wheel and makes it significantly harder for moderates to buy in. There are two implications of this. One, often the awareness campaigns get poisoned. People on the ground don't change their opinions to the same extent and are likely to buy into stereotypical depictions of black people as being violent. They often buy into the same pictures that opening government wants to solve, and this means more violence within communities. It often means more harm. Second, role models and others who often convey other people. The fact that you don't get significant amounts of media platforming is likely to happen. So you often don't get your message out there, because social media doesn't want to be seen as hatred inciting. They don't want to be seen as violence inciting. That means your message is often significantly more controversial on their side of the house, and so you don't get it out there. So, opening government's response to this is, guys, trust us, backlash is short-termist. I just don't think this is true. When you create a cultural rift and when you see it as significantly more radical, you're often knocked out. And yes, maybe you don't get backlash, but your movement fades into nothingness and you are replaced by another movement on their side of the house. Other social movements take up the space. Before I move on, does closing government have a POI? CG? Cool. CG?
I don't care if you get more aid programs. At the point in which individuals are likely to die, they're likely to be imprisoned. I don't care if you improve the neighborhoods themselves if people are not able to opt into those
The
areas.
reason why people go to prison is because you don't get legal aid. You have more money going to legal aid for their crimes on our side of the house. You have more money for the fact that they actively have jobs. You have more money for the fact that they don't need to commit crimes of necessity anymore on our world. Second question, why do we get better safety? The first claim here is that it's just what we told you, right? Vigilante justice isn't good on BLM. When you have gangs that exist and they shoot and then you shoot back, it's obviously really harmful. That's because you create more shootouts within the community. You create perceptions of unsafety within the area in many cases, and this is really, really harmful. Secondly, obviously the police is more likely to be brutal. I don't know why they're likely to have competitive incentives for policing. The right wing is likely to be like the police needs more money. And in many cases, they're likely to donate more. You likely give more political capital. And note, moderates uniquely buy into this narrative because they care about safety, because they often care about these types of policies, and so are likely to get significantly more money for these types of things on their side of the house. So you often get more escalation for the average black person. That means on the streets, you get more shootings for the average black person. You actively see them as more dangerous. Third, the average perception also changes. Note, the narrative now becomes these black people are holding guns on the street rather than they were shot by the police. This shifts the overturn window and makes it much harder for you to get the kinds of things that are necessary. Finally, let's say gun control laws are implemented. This is even worse, because the reason they were implemented was because black people were violent. So the police gets more weapons to shoot these people. The police gets more ammunition to engage in these kinds of harms, and that's particularly damning. I'm very proud to oppose.
All right, I'd like to thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for their very fine speech. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome the Member of Government.
Audible and visible?
Not yet visible. Okay, now it's visible.
Or you have to look at me. What was I gonna say? Right. POI. I'll ask for a POI from opening. They can dig into me if they want to. Okay. Start my speech. 3, 2, 1. Guns don't kill people. People kill people. 5 observations about top half, twofold extension. Observation number 1. Note, opening opposition asserts that moderate individuals obviously don't care about guns. That is to say that moderate individuals don't care about guns in the first place. This is contrary to the definition of a moderate. Moderate individuals generally tend to be more like flippant on the political spectrum, which likely mean that a certain level of moderates, maybe like half of them, probably do like guns, probably do think that individuals are too soft on crime within the status quo. Secondly, note, this washes out top half. Armed communities and the way they work is probably very difficult for us to imagine. It's extremely difficult for us to know on a case-by-case basis how armed communities are likely to exist within different places. This means in certain neighborhoods, there might be enough funding for them. In certain neighborhoods, there might not be enough funding for them. We need to support a general policy, which means that we need to consider the generality of things, and at the point at which this is likely a wash on both sides, this is not important for this debate. Thirdly, note that violent protests have already happened, contrary to what opening opposition wants to assert, so the BLM movement has already been seen as quite radical. Dennis responds to this by saying that, oh, radicalization is already likely to happen, which means that the people already have, they can have more negative perceptions, but at the point at which violent protests have happened, it likely means that individuals already have negative perceptions of the BLM movement. Also note they run into double bind here. Either they think that the BLM movement is too hard on crime, or they think that the BLM movement is too soft on crime. This likely means that backlash is symmetric, and you just get backlash from different groups, and this is not relevant to it within this debate. Fourthly, note that funding and money, which seems to be the top contention within top half, is all related to the conception of finding policy changes. Policy changes is extremely hard to do, fundamentally because of the fact that there is red tape, redlining, and obviously, even at the point at which the Black Lives Movement is a large movement, it doesn't change the fact that fundamentally voter blocks still generally tend to be dominated by white individuals within specific areas, which likely mean that you're not going to be able to pass the policy that you actually need. What actually matters then within this debate? And to understand that, you need to actually understand what goes on during the mind of a black individual and why they carry guns with them in the first place. Why does the culture that they live around necessarily promote lifestyles that generally include things such as guns and generally include them needing such guns in order to get safety in the first place? The extension that coming from closing government is extremely simple. Within the status quo, individuals, specifically black individuals and African Americans within America, generally feel the need in order to get guns in order to protect themselves and get their safety. I'm going to explain in my second half of this extension why there is a principle of self-defense that they should be allowed to do this regardless of pragmatic outcomes. But more importantly, I just want to note that within the status quo, the main reason why individuals and black individuals, for example, are sent to jail is because of the fact that they might have illegal possession of things. Because of the fact that they might have guns that they need in order to protect themselves, and the fact that they're not able to actually carry them openly in order to feel safe. This is the analytical burden that opening government misses within this debate. Because opening government just says that, obviously you just go to gangs because of the fact that you don't think that the police officers are safe. No, individuals, especially black individuals within the status quo, that might feel that the BLM movement is too hi-fi for them, obviously engage in things such as buying guns or getting these type of guns in order to make themselves feel safe in the communities that they live around. The impact of this then is that individuals within the status quo feel the need to go through illegal means in order to get guns, feel the need in order to engage with criminals in order to get guns. This is the risk of gang violence that OG talks about doesn't mechanize, and more importantly, this means that these individuals do not feel comfortable actually putting these guns out in public. Notice the impact of this. At the point at which individuals are now arrested constantly for actually having an illegal possession of these firearms because of the fact that it is extremely difficult for them to get access to firearms due to the narratives that exist around these individuals, what likely ends up happening then is that police officers actually arrest these individuals for illegal possession of firearms in the first place, which means they go to jail for that, which means that you never access opening opposition's benefits on aid and all, fundamentally because they're in jail. This is the POI that Justin talks about. And more importantly then, it means that these individuals are put in a double bind. Either they die due to the culture of gang violence that happens and they do not feel safe, or they buy the gun and then get arrested because of the fact that they have illegal possession. The argument here is extremely simple. At the point at which you legalize and actually make sure that open gun laws are much more embraced, not only do these individuals now feel much more comfortable carrying around these guns in public, which means one, you don't need to go to these illegal sources, reducing the risk of gang violence, and more importantly, because of the fact that now you're able to carry it alone, which means that you do not get arrested for these type of crimes. But note then, more importantly, this also changes the perception of black individuals as a whole. Black individuals on either side of the house need to hold guns due to the culture that exists around them, due to the safety that exists around them, due to the fact that over-policing happens, which means they need to protect themselves and feel a need to protect themselves. What ends up happening then on our side of the house is when you embrace these laws, you shift the Overton window. No, this is different from what OG says, because OG's Overton window shifting analysis is specific to the movement as a whole. The Overton shifting analysis that I'm giving you is that at the point at which you start embracing such laws, at the point at which you start saying that carrying guns is okay, you reduce the stigma on black people for carrying these guns, and this is going to be a good thing, because now it means that not only are these individuals not criminalized for these type of things, but you necessarily have engaging counter narratives against the narratives that exist within the status quo. The narratives within the status quo, as opening opposition correctly points out, are that black individuals are dangerous. Black individuals are dangerous. Why? Because they carry around guns. Why do they need to carry around guns is not the question that they ask, and that's the problem within this debate. When you openly embrace such laws, rather than being disrepresentative of these individuals, you necessarily shift the Overton window, you necessarily create counter narratives which say that they carry guns because of safety. They carry guns and they're embracing this carrying of guns, which likely means that they're going to do it well, which reduces the stigma on these individuals for carrying guns in the first place. I'm going to explain now, regardless of pragmatic outcomes on top half, why there is a principle that means that we should support this, but before that, opening opposition.
So the issue with this extension is that Infoslide caveats that these guns are legal right now. It's not illegal possession, so you do not get put into jail for this. You are allowed to carry on either side of the house. The difference is whether you embrace them and say, yes, let's everyone have a gun.
Well, yeah, there's a problem here, right? Two problems. One, obviously, at the point at which open gun laws are introduced, that likely mean that these individuals are able to access these guns better, which gets to all the mechanisms that I talked about. And more importantly, at the point at which individuals are not able to actually show these guns properly outside, or at the point at which they do not feel comfortable expressing themselves because of the fact that open carry gun laws are not actually present within the status quo, just the fact that they can possess it. So not only do you limit the accessibility of these guns on your side of the house, but more importantly, individuals don't actually get the perceptual safety, which leads to the violence in the first place, because only criminals then feel comfortable actually showing these guns out, whereas individuals that are innocent are not comfortable showing them in the first place, and this is significant for this debate. Secondly, a quick principle here. Individuals deserve self-defense, especially black individuals who have been failed by the state and have state reparative obligations, mean that these individuals should have the liberty in order to protect themselves. Why is this significant within this debate? Because obviously you as the Black Lives Matter movement want to act in the interest of black individuals. The interest of black individuals then is, first of all, not dying. At the point at which over-policing happens, at the point at which gang violence happens, and also at the point at which individuals have the liberty in order to own what they have because of the fact that the state has fundamentally failed them, which means that their autonomy should not be limited by the state. These individuals should have the fundamental right to hold these firearms and should have the fundamental right to express that. One, because of the fact that this is an act of self-defense, which likely means that these individuals are now able to at least have more bargaining powers / pressure the police officers that exist. This is OG's mechanism, but better. And also, more importantly, this necessarily means that now these individuals, at the point at which they have access to such firearms, can actually openly show that, now have the liberty and the reparative obligation to go back against the state that has been oppressive towards them in the first place. So, not only do we prove to you that you get less individuals because of false possession or the fact that they think they need to hide it, which leads to more violence, but we also prove to you on a principled standpoint why these individuals deserve to hold these guns in the first place. Very proud to propose.
All right, I'd like to thank the member of government for the very fine speech. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome the member of opposition here.
Okay. Can I be heard?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. If I were to summarize all of CG's case in a couple of sentences, it would be something like this. Communities need guns in order to be safe, so we should embrace guns in order for them to be safe. But I think it disgustingly misunderstands the way in which both gang violence and gun violence proliferates in disenfranchised communities in America, both the symptoms and the perpetrators of it. And what I want to do on CO is first explain exactly how this happens and why this necessarily means that any kind of police force that claims the BLM would always do so in bad ways, which is going to fill in the missing analysis from OO, and then prove why this leads to much more militarization with new mechanisms from opening opposition. First, why is it that gun violence and gang violence became popular within many Black communities in America? I recently had the pleasure of reading a book called Blue Rage, Black Redemption, written by the founder of Crips, and the way that he describes it is something like this. Post-1964, laws like redlining and red tape, and also broad sentiment that was extremely racist, made it really hard for Black communities to be able to find jobs. This led to massive, rampant homelessness and poverty within these communities. And at first came the Black Panthers, which was then shut down, and then literally inspired by the Black Panthers. Like, he literally says this in the book. They turned towards crime as a means to subsist because there was no other alternatives. Now, this then coincided with things like the opioid epidemic in America and the mass importing of things like drugs in underprivileged communities by Purdue Pharma and Broad Things, which then literally used to partner with gangs that, ended up taking a lot of power and made a lot of money, and then use that money to essentially get a chokehold in their communities, right? The Crips is now one of the largest gangs in America, and the Bloods, who were created in North Central LA as their rivals, are the second largest gang. I think what this indicates then is that even if it's true that these communities aren't necessarily all bad, and I do think this is true, right? That a small portion of them were able to profit off of inherently bad things to such a significant extent that now, in order to justify their reign and justify their control, they engage in things like turf wars, they indoctrinate people within their communities, and often have a chokehold over these communities in the first place. So, contrary to Ryan's analysis, which is true that people feel unsafe. It's untrue that people can have the means to do anything about it. The second question I want to ask then is how these things form, because I think that characterization from both OG and like OO and generally in this debate is that we're just going to magically import like police officers or just recruit people from these communities. But I think given how pervasive gangs are and the characterization that I just gave as to what these communities specifically look like, and notably, and this is like really obvious, but everybody missed it, the BLM movement isn't super centralized. Like the quote unquote founder just started like a Twitter and then quote unquote resigned as well 2 years ago. Seems to indicate that the ways in which people actually form these things, even if there's broad like pressure from outside groups, is largely an internal process, right? Which is to say that people that live within these communities form these movements in order to justify using things like guns in order to crack down on this. Who then does this? I think, given that people that have the most power, in a hierarchical structure that broadly exists in these gangs, it is likely that the people that do this aren't the people who feel genuinely afflicted as victims of gang violence, or the people who gangs often control through things like selling drugs, through things like profiteering off of rent, etc., etc., and is instead likely to be the gangs themselves who benefit off of using BLM as an excuse to proliferate types of violence that we broadly oppose. CG says this is good because people do this for safety. I hope that in 3.5 minutes, I've been able to dispel this absolutely woeful notion. And what I think this more likely then means is that when BLM actively endorses this and embraces this idea, you don't end up with safer communities. You end up with communities that justify more violence, and the worst people in these communities that justify more violence through this in a way that is actively bad for these communities. Why is this the largest impact in the debate? First, I think it's just the most realistic characterization of what happens when you endorse this in communities that are otherwise locked out of other alternatives. Increasingly also, though, I think it locks out the other option that you can take, which is denouncing this as the BLM movement. And I'll talk about why. I'll talk about why that's good a little bit later. But second, I think the impact here is the most significant, right? I think this proves concretely that the types of things you see once the BLM movement embraces something like this is an increase in violence, and notably violence that is not going to make people feel quote unquote safer, contrary to OG, but violence that is now directly tied to the Black Lives Matter movement. Why is this worse for social change as a whole? Is there a POI from OG or OG before that?
The problem with your extension is a question of the comparative. Cases in which people must seek violence for self-defense drive gang membership either way. Under our side, there is now an alternative institution with differing cultural norms which expresses an opposition to violence and hence is unlikely to be co-opted by gangs.
No, so as we point out, it's unlikely that this can actually be created in a sustainable way oppositional to this violence, because that is just really, really hard to do in these communities in the first place. And so it's likely that it's co-opted by people that just proliferate this violence further. I'll talk about why we're able to get this changed now. There's a couple of reasons under this. First, I think when you take on a stance that is very anti-gun, or at the very least very anti-violence, you're able to co-opt a far greater diaspora of voters that are otherwise left alienated. And I know this was like sort of the top half clash, in that OG's responses here were, well, backlash dies away in the long run. But I think given this crucial characterization that the types of violence seem senseless, or at least very least hard to justify, I think this further accentuates the harms of backlash, in that the people who otherwise may be like, moderate white voters or like progressive white voters who feel, maybe a greater sympathy to things like gun violence and school shootings, for instance, feel more alienated and can never justify that type of violence in the first place. What they want to see is a remedy, not a co-opting of the BLM movement in a way that actively deteriorates these communities in a much worse manner. And I think what that leads to is like the crucial ways in which broadly we've been able to actually get change in these communities, i.e. through people going down on the streets, like boots on ground support, through things like clinics and hospitals being helped out, through things like social aid being given or social welfare programs being supported, through things like court cases being won in the favor of these communities, through abolishing red line laws in California, for instance, or defunding the police. I think it was in Illinois. I don't remember exactly. Definitely not Illinois. Somewhere else. San Francisco. Are all the types of things that I think on our side of the house become more possible, the point at which you are no longer associated with the violence that we on CO uniquely prove will always be necessarily bad. And in the long run, because that is the weighing that OG wanted to hang their case on, if backlash goes away, it is on our side that we never need backlash to go away, because we never normalize the type of violence that we always inherently want to oppose. So in conclusion, this fills in the reasons for why OO misses out as to why violence will always be bad, and it takes OG at their best and proves that we still have a margin of change that they alienate and permanently alienate.
All right, I'd like to thank the member of opposition for their very fine speech. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome the government whip here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, great. 3, 2, 1. Now, there are two reasons as to why closing opposition cannot take this debate at the point in which they hang all of their case on the idea that there are marginally less people that are going to gangs in the first place. One, I don't know why this is the delta in this debate if it is probably true that these people are living in instances of poverty where gangs are oftentimes the only option that these individuals have on either side of the house. But second, we can literally flip this from both sides of government, right? At the point in which we told you there's less reliance on these gangs or on those adverse institutions on their side of the house, if it is probably true that now at the point in which you're able to carry a gun, you're able to push back against this. You yourself have the perception that you have enough safety and therefore do not need to opt into that gun, or therefore do not need to opt into those gangs or those cycles of violence in the first place. The response that we get from CO is quite baffling when they say like, aha guys, I don't know what this institution is because it doesn't take that much money. But we say there's a cultural institution and there's cultural norms that are shifted on our side of the house because now it is okay for you to carry your gun out in the out on the streets. Now it is okay for you to use these as a means of self-defense, whereas the margin here and comparatively is oftentimes you have these guns stowed away in your back pocket. You have these guns stowed away in your safe at home because you believe that this was the last resort. But guess what? These instances of violence happen on the street. They happen quickly to the point where you're not able to retaliate unless you have these out in the open in the first place. And that's the margin for this debate. The second thing CO tells you is like, aha guys, police forces will like have incentives to have more retaliation. If this isn't derivative, even if it is not, one, I don't know why it is the case that you have millions of dollars more and there's a margin to justify this if Rohan also tells you in the POI that it is also the case that NYPD has lots of funding within the status quo. I don't know why they can do more than they already are doing. And secondly, there are also natural incentives anyways for police to be brutal. At the point in which structurally they have things like quotas, they have over-policing, at the point in which they're often indoctrinated into institutions where you say you must crack down on crime in the first place. So I don't understand how it is even possible for these people to be more retaliative. Therefore, the change on our side of the house uniquely is, given that policemen have natural incentives to be able to be brutalistic and that they will be brutalistic on their side of the house, the change is that on our side you're able to necessarily have some kind of recourse in terms of being able to retaliate against those types of things. So that's CG out of the debate. But secondly, how do we necessarily engage with opening hat? Because I think the entry point that Sonam gives you goes relatively uncontested. It is unlikely that policy passing happens on either side of the house, and even if it does, it is unlikely that BLM is going to be a tipping point for that policy to be passed. There are three structural reasons for this. Firstly, there are already incentives to vilify BLM at the point in which it is often true that right-wing movements do things like group them together with other radical black movements. This looks like, for example, during the death of George Floyd, Trump does things like saying like, aha, when they attack small businesses, I'm unclear whether or not this is, by the way, BLM or not, they're able to homogenize this to saying all black people are doing those sorts of things. The reason why this is therefore important is because I don't think the average person is able to nuance out whether or not an atrocity was done by the Black Panther movement or whether it was done by the BLM in the first place. So at the point there was some atrocity being done, these are just likely to be homogenized by right-wing groups anyways who prey on things like visceral emotions from people. But secondarily, there are natural political incentives to also care about black conditions, even if they are slightly more radical within the status quo. At the point in which you do things like repeal back things like over-policing, at the point in which there are other BIPOC and GM groups that will benefit from these things because the Latino community is also necessarily being plagued by those same types of harms, means I just don't know why it is the case that AOC stops campaigning for those types of things. But thirdly, even at worst, I think support is a circular trade-off, right? So at the point in which you have maybe more moderate groups that lose out as a result of this, you have more radical groups that you're now able to co-opt into your movement, given that you're also taking the more radical stance. So I just buy that it is probably true that policy passing isn't the tipping point as opening opposition would like to posit. The reason why this is therefore important is because this bleeds into our extension. Because what was Sonam's extension really? We told you that the principle here takes a higher burden of this debate than what opening government has you believe. Because I don't care if backlash happens. I don't care whether or not you have enough resources for everybody to be able to openly carry guns or for some people to openly carry guns. But at the point in which this is an option, this in of itself is an important thing. And we gave you two structural reasons as to why this is the case. Firstly, there's significant right to self-defense given that police already have natural incentives to be bad. Because structurally they have things like quotas. There are natural incentives to do things over policing. So this is quite important. And secondly, this is also often a proportional form of recourse, right? Because oftentimes police themselves carry guns. Oftentimes black individuals were arbitrarily born into a state and born into conditions where they do not have the ability to do things like recourse. And the POI from opening opposition is to say like, aha, I don't know what the margin is on this. The margin is that the vast majority of atrocities that are committed by these individuals are often things that happen on the streets. They often happen when you're least expecting them to be because you previously had faith in the system. So even if it is true that guns are legalized, they still have to fight some sort of margin on their side where these guns are often stowed away in people's back pockets because they cannot overly carry them. Because it is probably the case that you stow them in the safe at your house, but when you're leaving out to shopping, that is the point in which over-policing and bad incentives necessarily happen, because that is where you're caught off guard. That is where cameras are not necessarily shown, and those are often the point in which individuals are the most vulnerable. Before I move on, closing.
Yeah, what happens when a Crip does a drive-by with BLM painted on the side?
And like, there are natural incentives to radicalize. I explained. Second, you can push back against those gangs. Also explained. What is the weighing and the positioning of this principle then? Firstly, I've already explained as to why the entry point is this debate. That is to break the deadlock that comes from opening half when there are quibbles on whether or not you're able to get enough resources as a result of this. The position from closing government is that I don't care whether or not you have enough resources to be able to access those things. I don't care whether or not legislation is actually able to happen. But at the point in which black individuals believe that they're able to necessarily use guns as a signifier of believing that they have recourse, that they're able to push back against the state to some extent, and they themselves feel that they are safe and feel that they're necessarily able to sustain themselves in a world where everything is pitted against them, that in of itself is an important thing. But secondly, there's also ways against opening opposition, right? Because I don't care if you get more aid, and the response from my POI is like, aha, you get legal aid, right? Because at the point in which you're in prison, you're isolated, you're unable to access those things. So at worst, it is circular, right? Because I don't know which one happens first. But at best, this weighing goes to on our side of the house, because at the point in which you're necessarily able to have the perception that you're able to be able to do these things, at the point in which you're necessarily able to survive, to sustain yourself. But secondly, the perception of safety is also a prerequisite to opting into the state. So at the point in which you believe that for you yourself, it is safe to go out of the house to be able to interact with natural commodities. You believe it is safe to engage with society in the first place. I think it is important, and therefore. But secondly, principle is often important for catharsis, because now you yourself believe that you're able to necessarily be able to have recourse against the state. You're able to believe that you yourself are valued as an individual, and are able to stake out the things that you yourself care about, and those are also massively important, because as an individual, those are types of things that give social value to people, not just money. It's also their ability to be safe, your ability to enjoy the pleasures in life, and that's what we uniquely give you on closing government. Proud to propose.
Alright, I'd like to thank the Gamul for their very fine speech. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome the opposition MP here.
Cool. Am I audible? Can people hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. Give me 1 second. There's a lot of material in this space. Okay. All right. Okay, I'll try and take a POI, hopefully from closing government, maybe opening government as well. Put it in the chat. I'll probably just ask for it though at some point. All right. 3, 2, 1. Let's just quickly explain why each team has kind of missed the debate. Opening opposition's case doesn't make sense for a couple of reasons. The first is that their whole mechanism for why this happens, the leftist movements disassociate, is because of like a cognitive dissonance. Like you can't simultaneously like pro a movement that's pro-gun and also be anti-gun. This is just trivially not true for a couple of reasons. The first is that people are often entirely fine believing this because they want to buy into the movement. People tie that identity in it. It's not a cost-benefit analysis. That is to say that Republicans can simultaneously be anti-drag queens to protect their children and also try and take away kids' free school meals. It is simultaneously true that we can believe that, like, you know, Trump was terrible for keeping kids in cages, but when Biden does it, that's totally fine. The important mechanistic nuance I'm putting at it is that there is a tipping point at which it happens. And just saying that there is going to be cognitive dissonance does not mean you hit any of your impacts. In fact, if opening government is right, that is characterized in a safe way, it probably doesn't happen at all. It's probably fine, and people can believe both anyway. Why is this important? Why is my partner's mechanism fundamentally win the op bench at the bare minimum, because he explains that the only people who are going to have the financial capital, the people most likely to have access to this, even if BLM movement doesn't want it, is likely to be criminal organizations that pre-exist in this area, because they have asymmetries of power, because the fact they have more money, they have the social capital control, the fact that BLM leaders have to concede to them at the point in which they have effective control over territory in the places that are so high crime rated, given opening government's framing. As a result, opening opposition is completely out of this debate. Secondarily, very important is that the issue of their case is that the trade-off doesn't exist if GovBench is right at any point. What I want to point out here is that if GovBench is right, because everyone can see that the reason that black communities have issues is because there are high crime rates, and the high crime rates come from poverty, and poverty causes high crime rates. If they solve high crime rates, in the long term, the structural issues that happen due to poverty go away, and the needing for BLM funding also goes away. This is important, because opening opposition does not work if they don't prove that crime rates don't change. That is very important. Let's go into opening government and explain why they're just entirely out of this debate as well. Opening government's case, less than no sense. They describe this as like some giant. This is the start of Avengers Assemble. He like snaps his fingers and everyone appears. So unrealistic. Like, it costs $10 billion a year for the NYPD. They have massive economies of scale. They can buy guns en masse. They have purchasing power parity. They have all of these things. You don't have any of this as a militia. But secondarily, I want to point out something very important here. Let's assume that this takes place in the realistic framing of like in high crime areas where BLM pushes money in. Why does this happen in very bad ways? Because even if you made pressure from the top level for this to be done well through all these incentives I want you to notice are from the top level only. That is to say that at the point at which this is a dissociated movement, people form these on their own and then request funding, given the likely mechanization they tell us about how BLM just simply provides channels to which you can fund into. The likely realism, therefore, is that you're going to fund money into people who do terrible things. I want to point out that even if it is a one-off chance, given the long-term impact on the BLM movement overall, this is a terrible, terrible thing. But secondarily, I want to point out that at the point at which this is likely to be co-opted by gangs, it does the opposite. At the point at which your organized crime group is able to access BLM funding, or at the bare minimum is able to collude with the BLM in order for BLM to operate in these areas in the first place, something that's uncontested from the government bench, the likely implication of this is that you don't get access to the safety at the point at which everyone frames that the issue is not random, but organized crime that is causing the issue in the first place, because of structural issues, which means that you have to commit crimes of organized necessity through social norms being pervaded. These get strengthened at the point at which it is normalized as a good thing. This means it is more likely you are going to join these movements, because at the point at which you believe that joining the Crips is a good cause. I'd like to point out it's not so simple as you're going to create a new set of social norms, because they don't provide the mechanisms for that. They just say they're going to create a movement. Okay, I have no idea where this is coming from. Let's quickly let's copy back from OG. Throw me something.
Yeah, if what you say is true, that gangs already have major resources, power, and access to weaponry on both sides, can't major gangs like the Crips just shoot people on either side?
Dude, think about what you're saying. So we're saying, just think about this conceptually. We're saying normalizing Crips having guns on the street is bad. You just conceded, probably not good if they shoot people if they have capacity to. That makes sense? So what we're saying is that issue is bad, doing this will make it worse. Structurally, it is likely it will go down over time because there are things like a contact theory. That is to say that people get normalized to the idea that black people aren't bad people. I think there's very realistic framing in OG that maybe it's true that BLM isn't too, is seen as quite good in liberal areas, and most people don't want to be racist. Which means in the long term, these issues structurally decline. But at the point at which you normalize the carrying of guns, you give them more capacity, you structurally segregate, that is to say that you lock off police from accessing these areas and dealing with this problem in the first place, which is a bad thing. Okay, that's the very important nuance. I'd like to point out this may not be my own personal view, but it is very important to frame that at the point at which 12 African Americans are illegally killed a year, the framing on the hundreds to thousands of people who die from criminal-related organization vastly outweighs this, just in orders. Let's deal with CG. CG's case, so insane. I don't even know where to start. One, all practical arguments are made of principles. Saying this as a principle is not a way to win a debate, no matter how much you wish it is. Their case is like, we're going to normalize carrying guns, and this is going to be good because people can self-defend. I'm gonna hate to break the news to you, but in these communities, if you're going to say that somehow it's going to be more normalized to carry opening guns, is it more or less likely, if self-defense is only used at the point a crime is pervaded, normalizing people carrying guns, if gangs have higher degrees of calibers of weapons, if gangs get to act first, if gangs have dominating power, if gangs can buy more guns, it is presumable the normalization of this is a bad thing in these areas, given that OG restricts this debate into places which have high crime in the first place. Therefore, as a result, your self-defense principle doesn't happen if you're defending yourself against a community that is trying to attack you for reasons the fact that it's pervaded by organized crime. This is a really big structural issue that takes place within this debate. Why does it become such an issue? What time am I on? Can I take a PY from CG? I can. CG, throw me something. CG, any moment now. You've got.
Our case isn't hung on practicals. It is that if you point in which you believe you're able to do those sorts of things, that's good for self-actualization.
Wait, what? That's your case? Your case is that BLM is going to say, guys, we should carry guns, and then you're going to feel bad about carrying guns. How are you planning? Okay, let's just weigh that up. More people die on our side, so you don't have agency. Ergo, you can't do this in the first place. Probably weigh this more heavily. Bare minimum, we prove to you that you get more violence, which means even if you want to carry a gun, carrying a gun in of itself is seen as risky. Or secondarily, you don't want to be involved in this in the first place. You feel necessitated to carry a gun. At the point, it is normalized for criminal organizations to openly carry themselves, which as a result makes it really bad. But finally, I want to put out just obvious flashpoint analysis. The likely result of my partner's eye case is that when people see this, people are going to freak the fuck out, okay? And this isn't going to be in like the nice way, because like opening opposition doesn't get there when like cognitive dissonance exists. The point is that the punch criminal organizations co-opt these benefits, or criminal organizations collude with these, which is the likely structural thing given all the mechanisms my partner explains and the historic truth of this. The likely implication is that the right wing heavily cracks down on this. The right wing uses this as an excuse to take away more socio-economic liberties for people, the ability to protest. It probably means that you restrict things massively. It means that things like Ron DeSantis can push through even more restrictive laws. In actuality, you get a policy backlash. It is true it is hard to get progressive policy, but regressive policy happens fast and happens quickly at the point at which conservatives are terrified of this. And this is important because there is not a universal Overton window. Conservatives watch Fox News. They don't take place in the same Overton window, which means the shocks are always much worse than that, than the marginal progressivism that happens on our side. They never get the benefit of the Overton window shift, and the point at which the backlash effect is not taking place within the same Overton bubble. For those reasons, I think we won.